The missing line was worth $612,800,000. It sat near the bottom of a quarterly board packet from the Crest Horizon Foundation, between a routine grant renewal and a paragraph about currency exposure. 3,200,000 shares of Crest Systems Class B stock had been transferred out of Crest Family Holdings for zero consideration. The receiving entity was called Horizon Global Access Trust. The line said the transfer had been approved unanimously. My name was printed under the word approved. The supporting document was listed as Appendix F. Appendix F was blank. If the transfer was what it appeared to be, more than $500 million in marital property had just disappeared into a charitable structure controlled by my husband. If the approval record was accurate, I had helped authorize it. And if the tax or governance treatment was improper, I was not just the wife who had lost the shares. I was a foundation director whose name had been placed directly under the decision. I did not call William. I did not call the foundation's general counsel. I did not forward the packet to my private email. I wrote down the document number, the version date, the exact share count, and the time the board portal said the file had been uploaded. Then I closed the laptop and looked across the reading room at the empty chair where my husband usually sat with a legal pad and a stack of books. William liked to say that every responsibility needed an owner. That afternoon, I realized he had quietly assigned ownership of the risk to me. My name is Claire Morgan Crest. I was 42 years old when I found the missing appendix, and by then I had been married to William for 17 years. People who only knew us from magazine profiles usually described me as the quieter half of the marriage. William was the founder of Crest Systems, the software company that had made him a billionaire before he turned 35. I had joined the company years later, after the first explosion of growth, when its products were everywhere but its internal operations still ran like a group project held together by caffeine and personal loyalty. I was not a programmer. My background was product operations. I built processes around people who hated processes. I made engineers document ownership, made finance and product teams agree on the same numbers, and made senior executives acknowledge when a deadline depended on something they did not control. That was how William and I met. He had walked into a meeting where 12 department heads were arguing over a failed launch and asked who owned the problem. I told him, right now, everyone owns a piece of it, which means no one owns the outcome. He smiled and asked me to stay after the meeting. For a long time, that was the language of our marriage too. We divided responsibilities because division made our life possible. William handled the company, capital allocation, and the endless group of people who wanted access to him. I handled much of our household governance, the charitable strategy, and later the internal process of the Crest Horizon Foundation. I did not decide which diseases deserved funding or which regions needed schools. Experts did that. My job was to make sure decisions had a record, conflicts were disclosed, and the board received the information it needed before it voted. I believed in that work. I also believed our financial life was documented with the same care. We had signed a post-marital property schedule 9 years into our marriage, after William's compensation structure changed and several large blocks of restricted shares began vesting. The schedule was not romantic, but neither of us pretended it was. It identified what William had owned before the marriage, what I had earned, what had vested during the marriage, and what sat inside Crest Family Holdings, the family company that paid taxes, held investments, and funded several joint projects. The 3,200,000 shares in the board packet had been listed in that schedule. Not approximately. Not as a percentage. The exact block. The last internal valuation I had seen placed the shares at $191.50 each. That was how I reached the number 612,800,000. I did the multiplication twice on a paper calculator in the reading room, even though I knew the first answer was right. The strange thing was that the room itself felt ordinary. Late sunlight rested on the shelves. A lamp glowed beside William's chair. On the table was the reading list his communications team released every winter because people found it comforting that a man who controlled a software empire still recommended history books. Nothing looked like a crime scene. Nothing looked broken. That was the first lesson of the entire process. When very wealthy people move assets, the room does not shake. A line changes. An appendix disappears. A familiar account takes one extra step through an unfamiliar entity. The violence is administrative. I reopened the portal and checked the prior quarter's package. In that version, Crest Family Holdings still appeared in the foundation's related party disclosure because it had pledged the shares but had not completed a transfer. The footnote said any final donation would require an independent valuation, tax review, and a separate board consent because William and I were both directors of the foundation and managers of the family company. I checked the annual audit package from 6 months earlier. Same footnote. Then I opened the cap table summary attached to our most recent family office report. Crest Family Holdings had been listed with 3,200,000 Class B shares. I opened the current summary. The line was gone. There was no replacement line for Horizon Global Access Trust. No charitable deduction estimate. No transfer price. No notation showing which part of the block came from William's premarital holdings and which part had vested during our marriage. It was as if the shares had never existed. I saved nothing outside the systems I was authorized to use. Instead, I created a handwritten index in a notebook I kept for board meetings. Document number. Version date. Reference line. Missing appendix. Prior cap table. Audit footnote. I had spent enough years teaching teams how to preserve decision records to know that the first step was not accusation. The first step was making sure I could describe exactly what I had seen. At 4:14 that afternoon, I sent a short message through the board portal to the Foundation's Chief Financial Officer, Naomi Bell. The Q3 packet references Appendix F for the stock transfer, but the appendix appears blank on my account. Please confirm whether the board has received the valuation, conflict review, and final transfer schedule. Naomi answered 23 minutes later. Thank you, Claire. The transfer was part of a technical charitable restructuring approved through written consent. Council has confirmed the packet is complete. I will check whether Appendix F is displaying correctly for all directors. It was a careful answer. It did not say she had seen the appendix. It did not say I had seen it. It did not explain why the transfer appeared nowhere in our current family holdings report. I wrote down her exact wording. William came home after 8. He entered through the side hall, still wearing the dark suit he used for foundation events instead of the softer knit clothes people associated with him. He found me in the kitchen cutting a lemon for tea. Naomi says you had a question about the Access Trust, he said. His voice was gentle. William rarely raised it. Anger made him quieter, as if volume were a form of lost control. I had a question about Appendix F. It is a technical transfer of a very large block of stock. He took a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water. The pledge was discussed last year. The pledge was discussed. The ownership structure was not. The economic purpose is the same. Not if the shares came from Crest Family Holdings. He looked at me then. Not surprised. Not confused. Measuring. Claire, the foundation cannot be governed by emotion. It was one of his favorite sentences. He used it whenever someone asked whether a technically lawful decision violated a promise that had never been written down. I had heard him say it to grant applicants, junior executives, and once to his own sister when he removed her from an advisory committee. I set the knife beside the cutting board. I am asking for the valuation, the conflict review, and the final transfer schedule. Those are not emotions. The lawyers handled them. Then why can't I see them? He drank his water and placed the glass on the counter with almost no sound. Because the structure is more complicated than the board packet needs to be. The board packet says I approved it. You did. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. When? In the omnibus written consent in May. I remembered the May consent. It covered a series of grant renewals, executive appointments, and administrative authority for the Foundation's summer projects. The digital signing page had been sent while I was traveling to a school health conference. I had read the main resolutions on a tablet in an airport lounge. The packet had been long, but I remembered the stock transfer because it had not been there. The May consent did not include a completed transfer. It authorized implementation documents. Which documents? The ones counsel determined were necessary. I stared at him. Appendix F. Among others. The appendix I cannot see. He gave the smallest sigh, the kind he used when a meeting had exceeded its scheduled time. You approved the purpose, Claire. I am not going to relitigate every administrative step at the kitchen counter. This is not an administrative step. It is $612 million in shares that were listed in our marital property schedule. His expression changed then. Not much. The warmth left first. That schedule did not prevent charitable giving. It prevented one of us from unilaterally removing identified marital assets. The shares were derived from my company. The block vested during our marriage and was placed in our family holding company. Because that was efficient at the time. And now it is efficient to say it was always yours? He turned away from me and looked toward the dark windows above the sink. Every responsibility has an owner, he said. Crest Systems was mine. The foundation strategy is mine. You agreed to manage governance, not to obstruct the mission. There it was. The sentence that had once made me admire him had become a border around everything he believed I was allowed to touch. I did not tell him I had compared the cap table versions. I did not mention the audit footnote. I only said, please restore Appendix F and the related valuation to the board portal. I will ask counsel to speak with you. I asked you. And I answered. He left the kitchen with his water. The next morning, at 6:32, I received an email titled Special Governance Review. The Foundation's General Counsel wrote that questions had arisen regarding my personal financial interest in the transfer. To protect the Foundation, an emergency written consent had temporarily suspended my voting authority and access to confidential board materials while outside counsel reviewed the conflict. The consent was signed by William and 3 directors whose appointments he had recommended. At 6:35, my Foundation email stopped loading. At 6:41, the family office portal rejected my password. At 7:12, the private bank called to say the revolving credit line connected to my family office distributions had been placed under administrative review. By 8, a communications executive had sent me a draft statement announcing that William and I were entering a mutually agreed period of separate focus, while continuing to support the Foundation's mission. I had not agreed to separate focus. I had asked to see Appendix F. William had answered by removing me from every system that could show me what Appendix F contained. The part that frightened me most was not losing the board portal. It was the speed. The emergency consent, the account review, and the public statement had not been created between dinner and sunrise. They had been prepared in advance. My question had not caused the response. It had triggered a plan that was already waiting. I took my personal laptop to a small office above the garage, a room William almost never used because the wireless connection was unreliable. I did not try to enter any system that had denied me access. I opened the copy of our post-marital property schedule that had been stored with my personal estate documents since we signed it. Then I read the share description again. 3,200,000 shares, held through Crest Family Holdings, acquired or vested during the marriage, subject to joint disposition procedures. The language was clear enough that even William had not tried to change the document. He had changed the path around it. At 9:15, Foundation Counsel sent me a secure message with 2 attachments. The first was the May Omnibus written consent. The second was a conflict questionnaire. The consent contained my electronic signature on page 27. On page 11, one paragraph authorized officers to complete all schedules, transfers, assignments, supporting instruments, and implementation documents reasonably necessary to carry out the approved charitable purposes. There was no share count. No receiving trust. No valuation. No Appendix F. The signature page said the completed packet had contained 34 pages when I signed it. The copy counsel sent me contained 58. I wrote both numbers in my notebook. The conflict questionnaire asked whether I claimed a personal interest in Foundation assets, whether I had threatened legal action against the organization, and whether my continued participation could harm its tax status. The questions were designed to make a simple request for records look like an attack on charity itself. I did not answer them. I called Mara Ellison. I had met Mara twice before at foundation dinners. She was a divorce and asset lawyer, but that description did not capture her. She had a calm way of asking one question that made everyone else in the room realize they had been answering the wrong one. A year earlier, she had helped a woman on one of our advisory boards separate a family business from a marriage without turning the entire dispute into a public spectacle. When Mara picked up, I said, "I need to know whether I am overreacting." She said, "That is usually the question people ask when someone powerful has already defined a reasonable reaction as disloyal." I told her about the shares, the missing appendix, the omnibus consent, and the access suspension. She interrupted only once. "Were the shares listed in a signed property schedule?" "Yes." "Do you have your copy?" "Yes." "Did you remove any foundation documents after your access was suspended?" "No." "Did you preserve anything while you still had lawful access?" "I have a handwritten index." "I did not download files." "Good. Keep it that way." She asked me to send only my personal property schedule and the messages counsel had delivered to my personal account. She told me not to answer the conflict questionnaire, not to sign the communication statement, and not to contact the foundation CFO again. "Are we filing for divorce?" I asked. "Not today." "Then what are we doing?" "Making sure the evidence still exists tomorrow." By noon, Mara had sent preservation notices to William's personal counsel, Crest Family Holdings, the foundation, the family office, and the private bank. The notices did not accuse anyone of fraud. They identified categories of records: cap table histories, transfer agent instructions, board packets and version logs, trust instruments, valuation materials, electronic signature audit trails, related party disclosures, and communications concerning my access. She copied me on nothing that I did not need to receive. "Do not confuse visibility with progress," she told me. "The less performance we create, the easier it is to see what they do next." What they did next was send a lawyer named Grant Mercer to the house. Grant had represented William for more than a decade. He arrived at 4, carrying a thin leather folder and the expression of a doctor about to explain that discomfort was actually good news. William did not attend. Grant and I sat in the library beneath a photograph of William ringing the opening bell after Crest Systems went public. "William wants to avoid unnecessary escalation," Grant said. "Then he can restore the board records. The records belong to the foundation. I was a director when the vote supposedly occurred. You remain a director. Your voting authority is temporarily suspended. And my family office access? That is unrelated." It happened 9 minutes later. Grant opened the folder. Inside was a proposed standstill agreement. William would restore a monthly personal allowance and authorize payment of my household expenses. In return, I would agree not to challenge foundation governance, not to seek records beyond what outside counsel chose to provide, and not to characterize the share transfer as marital asset dissipation. The allowance was $250,000 a month. The number was supposed to make the offer feel generous. Instead, it told me exactly what William thought my life was. A budget he could switch back on if I stopped asking who owned the stock. "Where did the 3.2 million shares come from?" I asked. Grant folded his hands. "From William's economic interests. That is not an entity. The source analysis is complex." Was Crest Family Holdings the record owner immediately before the transfer? "The shares passed through an implementation vehicle." "Which vehicle?" "That detail is not relevant to the standstill." I slid the agreement back across the table. "Then the standstill is not relevant to me." Grant did not look offended. He looked disappointed, which was worse because it meant he had expected the allowance to work. "Claire, there is another issue you should understand. The May consent authorized the transfer. Your signature is part of the record. If you now claim the transaction was improper, the foundation may need to evaluate whether your approval created a governance or tax problem." "Are you saying I approved documents I was never given?" "I am saying you authorized implementation. 58 pages were in the completed packet. 34 were in the packet when I signed. That was the first moment his expression changed. Only slightly. His eyes moved to the folder, then back to me. Electronic packets can display differently after completion. Then the audit trail will explain it. He closed the folder. You should be careful about turning a charitable commitment into a marital bargaining tool. And William should be careful about turning my signature into an empty container. Grant left without the agreement. That evening, the communications team released the statement without my approval. It said William and I remained united in our commitment to global education while reviewing our separate governance responsibilities. The story appeared online within an hour. Commentators described me as a co-chair stepping back. One headline called it a graceful transition. There was nothing graceful about having my name attached to a decision I could not inspect. I wanted to answer publicly. Mara told me not to. His advantage is that everyone already knows his version of him, she said. Do not spend your first leverage trying to replace a public image. We are dealing with property and records. The next morning, she introduced me to Tessa Grant. Tessa was a forensic accountant with a habit of drawing boxes on paper before she opened a spreadsheet. She arrived at Mara's office carrying no dramatic equipment, only a yellow pad and a mechanical pencil. She asked me to explain the shares without using the words hidden, stolen, or mine. I must have looked confused. Those are conclusions, she said. Give me the last point where everyone agrees. The shares were held by Crest Family Holdings. Good. Who owned the holding company? William and I were the economic members through our marital trust, but he managed it. Who voted the Crest Systems shares? William, under a management proxy. Who received distributions? The family holding company, then our marital accounts and tax reserves. She drew the first box and wrote Crest Family Holdings inside it. Now tell me the next point you can prove. The foundation board packet says the shares went to Horizon Global Access Trust. She drew a second box several inches away. We do not connect them yet, she said. Why not? Because Grant Mercer said they passed through an implementation vehicle. People reveal structure when they think complexity will end the conversation. Mara had already prepared a narrow request for temporary financial disclosure connected to the postmarital schedule. Because the shares were specifically identified and because my access had been cut after I questioned their disposition, she asked for record preservation assurances and documents sufficient to show title, valuation, and control. She did not ask a court to decide the entire marriage. She asked to prevent the asset path from changing again while ownership was disputed. William's team responded with 400 pages. Most of them were useless. Foundation mission statements. Old valuation policies. Board biographies. Public tax filings we already had. The actual transfer schedule was still missing. But volume creates mistakes. On page 312, an email chain referred to Northbridge Holdings LLC. The message was from a family office controller to an outside custodian. It asked the custodian to confirm that the Class B shares could move from Crest Family Holdings to Northbridge before the quarter closed, with no interruption to existing voting instructions. Tessa drew a third box between the first two. Crest Family Holdings. Northbridge Holdings. Horizon Global Access Trust. The email did not prove where Northbridge was owned. It proved that the board packet had skipped a step. The company registry answered the next question. Northbridge had been formed 11 days before my May electronic signature. Its manager was Halcyon Family Office Services. The beneficial ownership filing was not public, but the formation document listed an internal reference code that also appeared on our family office tax summary. Tessa circled it. This is not proof of ownership, she said. It is proof that the structure was built inside the same administrative system that manages your marital assets. Mara requested the transfer agent instruction for the shares. William's lawyers objected, saying the instruction contained confidential charitable information. Mara replied that a stock custodian's record of title and voting authority was not a donor biography. 2 days later, the custodian produced a confirmation letter under the temporary disclosure agreement. The shares had moved from Crest Family Holdings to Northbridge on June 28. Northbridge had transferred them to Horizon Global Access Trust on June 30. But the custodian had maintained the existing voting instruction in William's name. A complete charitable gift usually separates the donor from control, Tessa said. This kept the vote where it was. Does that mean the gift was fake? It means we keep reading. That was Tessa's version of hope. Never a prediction. Just another document. The next document came from the electronic signature provider. Mara did not accuse anyone of altering my signature. She requested the completion certificate and packet history because the foundation relied on the consent as evidence of my approval. The certificate showed that I had opened and signed a 34-page packet on May 9. It also showed that an administrator had replaced the compiled PDF on May 22, preserving the same envelope identifier while adding 24 pages labeled implementation schedules. Appendix F had been added 13 days after I signed. My electronic signature had not been forged. It had been displayed at the end of a packet that no longer matched the packet I reviewed. Grant Mercer called it a clerical compilation practice. Mara called it an information problem. I called it the moment my marriage stopped being ambiguous. William had not simply moved an asset and hoped I would not notice. His system had placed my legitimate signature beneath documents added after the fact, then used that completed packet to remove me when I asked to see them. Still, we did not have the full economic loop. We knew where the shares went. We knew William retained voting instructions. We did not yet know whether he could direct value back toward himself. Then Naomi Bell, the foundation's CFO, resigned. She did not call me. She sent a letter to the foundation's audit committee stating that recent governance restrictions prevented her from certifying the related party disclosure. Because the letter fell within the preservation request, it was produced to both sides. One sentence changed everything. Management has not provided the audit committee with the side letter governing mission-related investments by Horizon Global Access Trust. Tessa underlined side letter twice. Mara requested it the same day. William's lawyers said it was privileged. Mara asked who the client was. They said the trust. She asked why foundation management had relied on it while withholding it from the audit committee. They did not answer. The dispute went before a retired judge serving as temporary discovery referee. William's team argued that disclosure would expose sensitive charitable strategy. Mara did not ask for grant recipients or program details. She asked only for provisions concerning voting, revocation, investment direction, and related parties. The referee ordered a limited production. The side letter was 6 pages. Page 2 confirmed that William retained sole authority to direct the vote of all Crest Systems shares held by the trust. Page 4 allowed the trust to allocate up to 40% of its assets to mission-related investments selected by a committee appointed by William. Page 5 identified Crest Future Ventures Fund 3 as a pre-approved mission investment. William controlled the general partner of that fund. Tessa finally drew the connecting arrow. Crest Family Holdings to Northbridge Holdings. Northbridge to Horizon Global Access Trust. William kept the votes. The trust could invest back into William's private fund. The asset had left our marital balance sheet without leaving his control system. When Tessa showed me the diagram, I expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired in a way that seemed older than the dispute. The boxes were simple. The betrayal had required hundreds of professionals, committees, accounts, and carefully chosen phrases, but the result fit on one sheet of paper. William had always told me complexity was the price of doing meaningful work at scale. I had defended that idea to people who found our world excessive. I had said a global company needed layers, a foundation needed specialized structures, and a family office needed privacy to function. Now I understood that complexity could also be used as distance. If enough people handled one piece, no one had to say the complete sentence out loud. The complete sentence was this: William had moved a specifically identified marital asset into a structure that preserved his vote, created a path back to his private investment fund, erased the asset from our family report, and placed my signature under the implementation documents. Mara still wanted one more category of records before she pressed for a full asset credit order. The side letter showed control. The audit work papers would show how the transaction had been valued and whether the foundation's accountants considered the trust independent. The audit firm resisted at first. Then the discovery referee ordered production of work papers limited to the share transfer, related party analysis, and valuation. The files arrived in a secure review room. I did not attend. Tessa did. She called me afterward from Mara's office. The transfer was booked at $124 a share for gift accounting purposes, she said. I stopped walking. The internal family valuation was $191.50. I know. The difference was more than $200 million. The work papers contained a note explaining that the lower value reflected transfer restrictions and the charitable holding period. But another page showed that Crest Future Ventures had used the higher internal value when calculating the size of the trust's permitted investment commitment. Lower value when the shares left the marriage. Higher value when Williams' private fund measured what it could receive. There was also a related party receivable for $18 million from Crest Future Ventures to an affiliate of the trust. The receivable had not been repaid by the quarter end. That was the deeper layer. The structure did not merely preserve voting power. It created an economic relationship between the supposedly independent charitable trust and Williams' private investment system. Mara filed for temporary asset protection and formal marital disclosure the next morning. The request was narrow but serious. She asked that the 3.2 million shares be treated as disputed property, that no further transfer or voting change occur, and that the transaction be included at the higher contemporaneous valuation until ownership and credit were resolved. William called me before his lawyers responded. It was the first direct call since the night in the kitchen. You are asking a court to interfere with a charitable gift, he said. I am asking for the shares to be valued the same way when they leave our marriage as when they support your private fund. Silence. Then he said, Tessa Grant does not understand the investment purpose. She understands the numbers. Numbers without context create false conclusions. Then give the audit committee the context. His voice hardened. You are damaging an institution we spent 15 years building. You removed me from that institution the morning after I asked for a missing appendix. Because you had a personal conflict. I had a disclosed marital interest in shares you moved without telling me. They came from my life's work. And they vested during our marriage, sat in our holding company, paid our taxes, supported our joint credit, and appeared in a schedule you signed. So this is about money. I looked at Tessa's diagram on my desk. No, I said. It is about whether a promise stops existing when the person with more power finds a structure complicated enough to hide the exit. He breathed out slowly. What do you want? A complete accounting. Independent valuation. My signature removed from any document I did not review. And my share of the marital property placed somewhere you cannot manage. That would require unwinding years of planning. Then you should have included me when you planned it. He ended the call without saying goodbye. The temporary hearing was scheduled for the following week. It never happened. 2 days before it, Williams' lawyers proposed mediation. This time, the offer did not include a monthly allowance. It included an asset schedule. The first version valued the transferred shares at $438 million. Tessa rejected the discount assumptions line by line. The second version credited me with $180 million but deducted a hypothetical tax liability that the foundation, not I, would bear. Mara rejected that too. At mediation, Williams sat across from me at a table long enough to make conversation feel optional. He wore a dark knit sweater under a jacket, the uniform the public associated with patience and reason. Grant Mercer sat beside him. Mara and Tessa sat beside me. William opened by talking about legacy. He said the foundation's projects could not survive uncertainty. He said a public dispute would distract from education and health programs. He said donors and governments needed confidence that our personal issues would not change institutional commitments. Mara let him finish. Then she placed 3 pages on the table. The signed property schedule. The side letter preserving William's control. The audit page using two different values for the same shares. We are not asking the foundation to return program funds, she said. We are asking the marital estate to recognize the value removed from its balance sheet while Mr. Crest retained control and related party investment rights. Grant began explaining why the trust was irrevocable. Tessa said, irrevocability is not the only question. The valuation, vote, investment direction, and related party receivable all point back to Mr. Crest's control system. William looked at me. Did you come here to dismantle the foundation? No. I came here because you used the foundation to dismantle our property agreement. For the first time since the dispute began, he looked less angry than surprised. I think he had expected me to demand his public humiliation. He understood reputational warfare. He knew how to manage headlines, statements, and donors. What he did not know how to manage was my refusal to fight on that field. I did not want his books removed from reading lists. I did not want strangers analyzing our marriage. I wanted an account with my name on it, shares he could not vote, and a settlement that did not depend on his continued goodwill. The mediation lasted 14 hours. The final agreement treated the 3.2 million shares as a transfer from identified marital property at a negotiated value of $612,800,000. My economic share was $306,400,000. I received 1,400,000 Crest Systems shares through an independent custodian, with no voting proxy to William. A cash equalization payment covered the remaining value after taxes and other asset adjustments. My personal investment accounts were separated from Halcyon Family Office. The private bank restored my access under an independent relationship team. William agreed that my electronic signature could not be represented as approval of the implementation schedules added after May 9. The foundation did not collapse. It added an independent audit committee. Related party mission investments required approval from directors appointed by neither William nor me. The trust kept the shares it already held, but William's personal voting direction was replaced with a neutral fiduciary process. The $18 million receivable was repaid with interest. Those changes mattered to me, but they were not part of my personal victory. My victory was smaller and more permanent. The system finally described reality accurately. The divorce itself took another 5 months. By then, the central asset fight was finished. We negotiated the house, personal property, and several smaller investments without pretending every disagreement was a moral crisis. William kept the large estate and the reading room. I kept a cedar and glass house outside the city with a smaller library, large windows, and no board packet waiting on the table. I resigned from the Crest Horizon Foundation after the independent committee was installed. Some people thought that meant William had won the governance fight. They were wrong. Staying was no longer the point. I had spent years maintaining an institution whose structure allowed one person's confidence to substitute for everyone else's consent. I did not want a restored chair inside the same marriage. With $12 million from my own settlement assets, I created a small education fund focused on public school technology access. It had no founder-controlled voting shares. Every grant decision required a conflict disclosure. Every board packet was complete before anyone signed it. The rules were not glamorous, but they were visible. Mara remained my lawyer through the final decree. Tessa helped me build an investment reporting system simple enough that I could open one page and see ownership, control, tax basis, and access authority without asking anyone's permission. For the first time in 17 years, my financial life did not arrive through a family office chosen by my husband. The first quarterly statement from the independent custodian came on a rainy Monday morning. 1,400,000 shares were listed under my trust. The voting authority line named the independent fiduciary I had selected. The cash balance matched the settlement schedule. There was no footnote directing me to another entity. No missing appendix. No blank space where ownership should have been. I printed the statement and placed it in a blue folder. Then I closed the file. William built his empire by making sure every responsibility had an owner. I rebuilt my life by making sure ownership could not be changed behind a missing page. The settlement was silent, the records were complete, and my future finally belonged to me.